I have the distinct pleasure of helping to kick off this afternoon and DevSecOps Days here at RSA. This is going to be a really interesting presentation. If you are in financial services, if you have a gigantic organization that you have to manage, if you have an organization that has the responsibility for moving billions of dollars in transactions around the world, if you're operating in a highly governed organization with lots of policies and processes that you have to follow that are probably state, local, federal, and everything in between, this is part of how you live at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. These guys are going to share a lot of how they're using some common services and common infrastructure to minimize the vulnerability defect ratios within the Federal Bank of New York's application portfolio. So defect density was talked, or vulnerability defect density was talked a lot about this morning. I think you guys are going to hear a little more of that this afternoon and what these guys are doing. And I actually had the pleasure about 20 years ago of working with Colin Wind when we were both back at HP, now at the Federal Reserve, and Jonathan DeRose, his colleague as well, that are going to share their story of their DevSecOps journey. So without further ado, Colin and Jonathan, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Derek. Okay, so first thing, I do work in a very heavily regulated environment. So here's our legal disclaimer that the views we express here are our own and do not represent necessarily the Federal Reserve Bank of New York or the FRS, right? So this is an indication of the kinds of stuff that we talk about. So hopefully everyone remembers your 5th grade civics. And so the Federal Reserve System is unlike a lot of the other central banks around the world. We're actually broken up into a board of governors that are actually government employees. And then there's actually 12 independent legal entities that are technically nonprofits that are distributed around the country. And that was set up 100 years ago before technology. So because of the legal structure, and the way that we actually operate and the way it was structured, it makes it very interesting to try and do things like DevOps or even application development with a common kind of sets of tools because there's no one to escalate issues with. Right? So there's nobody, if I have an issue with, say, San Francisco about how they are operating, there's no way for me to really escalate that because there's no common reporting structure. Unlike in a typical kind of large company, there's always a CEO. Here, there's actually an equivalent of 12 bank presidents, and there's nobody really above them to kind of force communication. So we spend a lot of our time kind of like herding cats, right? That's kind of the goal of what we end up having to do, a lot more communication, and it gets a lot of interesting on how different people operate. And so we'll talk a little bit about some of that we do. So my name's Colin Wind. I'm responsible for the Common Services organization within the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And we kind of act as, the best way of describing it is a little software house. So I have half a dozen teams, and a couple of them we're really going to talk about today. First one is the ReUse team. So we build reusable libraries and microservices that are embedded into large-scale applications, right? So we go from your tiny application, the cafeteria menu system, all the way up to Fedwire. And Fedwire roughly does about $1,000 trillion a year in transaction volume, right? So we go from, a few transactions a day on cafeteria menu system, all the way up to systemically important or critical applications, and all in between. And so that really is where we get into, a lot of concerns about security, right? So we talk about applications can't go down, right? Fedwire can't go down. right? So Fedwire roughly does, I think the 2009 public data, about $2 to $4 trillion a day. So if we were to go down, right, that's a hit on the economy, right? So it's that level of criticality that we're talking about with the tools and the reuse that we do. So what we've done with this reuse team is built a series of libraries and some microservices that are actually then embedded into these applications, not just in New York, but actually developers across the whole of the Federal Reserve System. And then the other piece that we're going to talk about today is a standardized set of tools to allow everybody to build and then deploy our applications. And again, it doesn't really matter if it's a really small application or if it's a very large and complicated application. The idea is we want to treat all of them very similarly because of the risks and the level of exposures that we're under. So I'll just pass it on to Jonathan, and we can talk about the different types of applications.
Great, thanks. So my name is Jonathan DeRose. I work with Colin in the Common Services Organization, and I'm going to talk through some of how we came to be where we are. So we started Common Services 7-8 years ago, and when we did, we were looking at our application portfolio, and we were looking at the landscape, and we were looking how our applications being built, first in New York, and then we've slowly sort of expanded the view to across the system. But what we saw was teams were making all of their decisions in silos. So their approach to security would be maybe consistent for the team, but certainly not beyond a team, and hopefully a little consistent from app to app within that team. Same thing for the tooling, how they were doing builds, how were they, what servers were they running on? Everything was a snowflake. And what we sort of recognized was this was, one, tremendously inefficient, but it was also tremendously risky. So because everything is different, you have no way to measure. And Colin didn't really introduce the next sort of topic we're going to get into is the tooling. So we had very limited visibility into how everyone was doing everything. So what we looked at was we could say, all right, let's build these different silos, and let's figure out, can we come up with standard ways to do these things? And the standard doesn't mean exactly every application is going to be the exact same, but it means we're going to give a certain amount of guidance, a certain amount of boundaries, and a certain amount of services that will allow applications to have that sort of consistency of approach, so developers can really be focusing on that top level of building that business value and not reinventing authentication authorization for every single application. So fast forward to today, our very small reuse team accounts for roughly 1/3 of the custom written code in the organization, and it's less than 1% of the overall development size. So tremendous impact in hundreds of applications. So then what we started to do is we said, all right, how can we share this across the system? And so the idea was, let's take this and we'll form a virtual team, right? So as Colin was alluding, we have members working out of our team from San Francisco, from the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, folks in Atlanta, folks in Minneapolis, and really sort of building that cross-district model. Because again, we don't have a way to sort of raise the you can't raise issues, yet at the same time you're inextricably linked. If there's a vulnerability, if there's there's a lot of talk of Equifax this morning. If there's an Equifax situation in the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, the entire Federal Reserve, that distinction of, well, that was Chicago, will be certainly lost with the general public and is not where we want to be. So we are inextricably linked with organizations that, again, we don't have a line of reporting up to. So it's an interesting challenge that we've been going on for the past couple of years to build these virtual teams, to get sort of the horses marching in the same direction. But we're getting there, and so it's a really exciting place to be. So we've got libraries for security. We've got the standard tooling. We've got we built a reference architecture, I think, 4 years ago. That was a wonderful new thing for the Federal Reserve System. So just on and on, basically, our goal is to say at each one of these levels, how can we have teams be able to onboard? So again, greenfield application, it's easy. You just take the whole stack. But one of the other things we had to really be mindful of is within any one of these layers, we've got a lot of long-lived applications, right? And so when we started this, people would say, oh, we can't use your authorization component. We've got our own, and our apps working fine. And so how do you account for that? How do you adjust for that? And how do you build into Teams sort of portfolio to upgrade and maintain over time? And so where we sort of got with this was a bigger focus on technical debt and labeling and introducing and sort of pushing that through the organization and through the system in terms of thinking about so as we think of ourselves as a small little software house, you think of this as the equivalent of open source. So the idea of doing that culture shift to have everyone think of, I have to update my internal code the same way I have to update my open source code was led to some success with that. So with that, I think I'm going to pass it back to Colin. Oh, actually, sorry, we classified it into three categories, but here you go.
Okay, so the whole idea, what we've started to build, and this is always an ongoing process, is a set of tools that allow our developers and then our operations to actually look at what's actually going on in our pipeline and be able to have a look at it for example, from a quality perspective. So if you remember, your typical application that we see has a lot of open source components in it, so we're always worried about vulnerabilities in the open source, as Equifax found out. But we have that level of concern is, what are the libraries we're using? What are the libraries that we are looked to using? And making sure that they're going to be backed by some level of support. So we never really want to pick on the latest, greatest JavaScript library that Joe and his garage put together over the last few weeks, and it might have a really neat feature, but there's no kind of tenure to it, and there's no kind of visibility across a lot of the industry. So we actually look at a lot of the open source libraries. We want to try and see, okay, is this going to be long-lived? Is this going to actually have some level of support behind it so that as it evolves, it's going to evolve in a direction that we really want to see? And then, is what happens if there is an issue, right? Can we actually get a patch for it very quickly? And all of that. So, we actually go to our developers, right, and we'll actually say, no, you can't use this really cool widget. It happens all the time with JavaScript, Python's other great languages where and there's lots of really cool libraries that come out, and then 6 months later, they'll disappear. And we really can't afford that level of risk, being able to use some really cool features and then have it disappear, because that application, one, might be critical, and two, a lot of our applications are long-lived just because of the nature of what we do. So how do you evolve that quickly? So we don't want to take on a tremendous amount of technical debt by picking up the latest and greatest library. We want to be leading, but not bleeding edge, and that's kind of our philosophy. So we also look at things like, how do we actually build and automate our builds, right? There's lots of vendors that can do that. And the idea is we want to enable our developers to build anytime, and we basically process hundreds of builds per day across our application infrastructure. And same thing with the other thing that we're very paranoid about is testing, right? So if you've got very large critical applications, how do you actually run through your automated regression tests in a timely fashion? And how do you actually develop that hand in hand with our applications? Again, a lot of applications are going to be long-lived, so we can actually invest in a lot more higher quality testing than a lot of other groups as well. And so we kind of break this into really 5 areas. So the one is, how do we actually make our developers really productive? So how do we actually keep them in the IDE of their choice? How do we offer them the right level of plugins so they can actually look and debug their code? They can actually understand the quality of their code in a timely fashion. So, it's a bit of a painful mantra, but we really want to keep people sitting down, our developers in there, actually coding away and not have them context switching to other tools again and again, because that really reduces their productivity, as well as what we found out is actually increases the likelihood of getting issues inserted into the code if they're always context switching to another place. The other thing that we do is, we love our quality. We really try and look at what's the level of quality of the code that these developers are actually producing. And we actually have, as you get off our elevator, we actually have a nice, dashboard. So a big TV screen that shows, who are the top quality apps. We also have, a wall of shame of, basically the bottom quality applications. And one day we'll start showing names of people that broke the build. But that's the idea of we want to actually share a lot of the quality, and we'll actually escalate issues to managers to say, okay, this code is great, but it's got a lot of issues. You probably need to look at your developers. Maybe you've got some new developers. Maybe you've hired some consulting or contractors. They don't quite understand how we want to do application development. And so, you need to go and drill down, maybe do some education, and what are the tools that we can help you with that. The other thing that we are big into is compliance, right? We have an enterprise reference architecture. How are we actually developing code that adheres to that enterprise reference architecture and do it in such a fashion that it's automated? So how do we actually check? We want to basically check to see if people are actually using, for example, our reusable libraries. And if not, why not? So a simple example, we have a standard way of doing audit logging. Right? If you think of it from an operations perspective, we want everyone to do the same audit log and log the same way, day in, day out. And so one of the simple libraries that we wrote was an audit log, because what we found when we did the research, we actually had more debug logs and audit logs than applications. So what that meant was, in our code base, what we found is multiple people over time had actually added their own multiple different audit logs and debug logs into the application. And that, from an operations perspective, makes it really hard. So if you think about it, right, if you're in operations, you might be using a tool, log monitoring tool like Splunk, for example, right? You don't want your operations people spending their time, right, configuring the applications, because there's different logging formats and logging standards each application. We basically want it all automated so that you launch an application into production. Basically, Splunk can then be automatically configured because it knows where to look on what the audit log, where it is and the format is. So it all gets pulled into Splunk, and then we can generate reports. Our information security people can then query the Splunk database, for example, and all of that kind of works seamlessly. So that's the value add of a lot of the tools and a lot of the monitoring that we have. And so I'm going to pass it off to Jonathan for the last slide.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to go back for one quick second. 5 minutes? All right. So along those lines of talking through training, one of the other big pieces that we've done is we've built a thing we call Common Services University. So you've got both a week-long course, we call that the core curriculum, and that's where we have those developers that might need they might need shoring up, or just somebody coming into the organization, or anywhere in between, basically, where we sort of indoctrinate how you go about leveraging all these different services, whether it's the security common components, or the tooling, or the and within the tooling, what does for an example, an IQ server report look like, or what do we care about in, for example, sonar? So really, this continuous learning and continuous feedback is really about how we really start to shape the culture. So we've been doing the CI/CD for 7-8 years now, starting smaller and getting up over time. But really, where we were getting stuck was really the culture of the whole organization. It's great to have the automated capability, but when we weren't working with the operations folks, when we didn't have our information security all lined in, it was really, that's the education and the continual working together is really what we've been shifting for there. So last, just sort of talk about a little bit back into the reuse and sort of how we think about it, right? So one of the other the challenges of working in sort of this federated environment is the concept of, there's always the concept of competition, I'll say, and so how do we work against that, or how do we sort of break that down? And we really do it by sort of articulating our vision of where we fit and where where the rest of the world is, and how you can work together and how all of these different approaches are complementary. So we start, of course, with the base of open source software. That's the majority of what we're going to pull down for any particular application. And so it's absolutely instrumental, and it solves very, very broad problems. If someone at the Federal Reserve Bank was writing their own something to handle HTTP requests as part of their standard business, we'd have a problem, right? So then you take it up a level and you say, all right, so what are the things that we can decide on as an enterprise that we can make an agreement and that really pays dividends to reuse that code? So I talked a little bit about authentication authorization, and authentication is really a bit of a misnomer because infrastructure more or less authenticates, and then we collect it and present it and contextualize it for the users, but conceptually that's what it is. And we don't want every team focusing on authenticating and authorizing and so on and so forth. And then you go up to the next level, which is your team level reuse. So within an application, every report that application is going to spit out wants the same header, the same footer. That's not where this enterprise team sits. And then lastly, it's the very business-specific code. We want our developers spending as much time up there as possible. So that's where you're moving the trillions of dollars or telling what's on sale at the CAF. It's, our whole mantra is pushing developers to be as innovative as possible up top, leveraging as much as they can from what's lower in the stack. So if they can get something, go as low as you can go. And then one of the other pieces we did back to that culture piece is really focusing on having an inner source model to sort of allow feedback, allow folks from around the system to contribute to propose patches and really become effectively co-owners. So really treating ourselves like a little open source shop, or a little open source wing of our shop, I should say. And so that's where we're at. So I think.
Okay, I think we're well out of time. Yeah. So we'll be here, floating around if you have any questions. So thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you.